In the golden age of exploration, when humanity's eyes turned skyward with the promise of touching the stars, NASA stood as a symbol of brilliance, courage, and impossible dreams. It was the agency that had carried humankind from the dusty battlefields of Earth to the cold silver silence of the moon. Its rockets thundered through history, its astronauts were heroes, and its name had become synonymous with progress. But behind the flawless televised launches and the proud speeches, there was a thread of fragility, one woven through danger, politics, human error, and the constant weight of expectation. The mission that nearly ended NASA wasn't born in a single night. It was the slow result of ambition colliding with reality and of humanity learning that the pursuit of greatness often comes at a cost. It began after the triumph of Apollo. The world had watched men walk on the moon and return safely home. And in that moment, NASA had become almost invincible. But after glory comes complacency. After applause comes silence. The world began to lose interest. Politicians asked why billions were being spent on space while problems festered on Earth, and NASA found itself fighting for every dollar of funding as the 1970s dawned. The agency searched for its next great purpose. The shuttle program was meant to be a reusable spacecraft that would make space travel routine, cheap, and safe. But dreams are never that simple from the start. The program was plagued with delays, engineering, compromises, and budget cuts. The engineers wanted safety, redundancy, perfection. The politicians wanted deadlines and spectacle, and between them the shuttle became something neither side fully trusted. When the first shuttle, Columbia, finally launched in 1981, it was a miracle of human ingenuity, yet also a fragile experiment wearing a mask of confidence. The astronauts who flew it knew the risks, but they also carried a spirit older than fear, a belief that humanity must keep climbing even when the ladder shakes. The missions that followed carried satellites, telescopes, and even the dreams of school children. But behind every success were close calls, tiles breaking off during re-entry, fuel lines freezing, minor warnings ignored in the rush. To meet schedules, NASA's culture of perfection had begun to crack. Then came Challenger, January 28, 1986, a day that would scar history forever. Millions of people watched live as the shuttle carrying 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, disintegrated just 73 seconds after liftoff. It wasn't supposed to happen. It couldn't happen. The shuttle was safe. That was what everyone believed. But a tiny O-ring in a booster joint had failed due to cold weather. A small, overlooked detail that destroyed everything in seconds. The nation mourned. NASA was broken. Congressional investigations followed, revealing the uncomfortable truth. Engineers had known about the potential problem, but management overruled warnings. To meet the launch schedule, it was a moment that forced NASA to confront itself. Stripped of pride, left with guilt and grief. Challenger didn't just destroy a spacecraft, it destroyed trust. And that's when the mission that nearly ended NASA began, not as a single flight, but as an era of doubt. The agency's future hung by a thread. The American public began to ask if it was worth it. The dreams of space were replaced by fear of failure. Years passed. The shuttle flew again, but the shadow of Challenger never left. Then in 2003, Columbia fell from the sky during re-entry, its heat shield damaged by foam insulation that broke off during launch again. Warnings had been raised again. They had been softened, ignored in the bureaucratic shuffle. 7 more lives were lost, and with them, NASA's spirit flickered. The agency that had once stood as the pinnacle of human capability was now seen as flawed, human, and painfully mortal. Some whispered that NASA had lost its way. Others called for its end. Funding was cut, projects were shelved, and many believed the space age had died right there in the burning skies over Texas. But what most people didn't know was that behind closed doors, NASA was preparing one final test, a mission so ambitious and so secretive that it could either save the agency or end it forever. It was conceived not for glory but for survival. In the aftermath of Columbia, NASA leadership realized that they could no longer justify human spaceflight unless they could prove it had a future beyond the shuttle, beyond low Earth orbit. Thus was born a mission that few outside the agency even knew existed, a high-risk prototype mission to test the technologies needed for deep space travel using an experimental, unmanned vehicle called Prometheus, named after the Titan who gave fire to mankind. It was meant to reignite the flame of exploration, yet just as the myth warned, fire comes with a price. The Prometheus craft would use a revolutionary nuclear-powered propulsion system, a concept decades in development but never tested in orbit. The goal was to reach deep space faster than any previous spacecraft to demonstrate the potential for human missions to Mars. But the risks were immense. One failure and radioactive debris could scatter through the atmosphere. The political fallout would be catastrophic, and the trust NASA had barely rebuilt would vanish forever. The team behind Prometheus worked in secrecy under immense pressure. Every subsystem was tested, every line of code reviewed, yet time and budget again dictated compromise. Some of the engineers feared the parallels to Challenger and Columbia were too strong. Whispers of doubt spread through the labs, but the clock was ticking by. 2006, the world had changed. NASA was now competing with private companies. New space startups were rising, promising innovation and cost efficiency. NASA's relevance was questioned again, and so the agency doubled down. Prometheus would be the mission. To prove its worth, the launch date was set. The world didn't know it, but history was about to balance on a knife's edge. As the countdown began at Cape Canaveral, the air was thick with tension. The control room filled with the hum of machinery and the muted voices of hundreds of men and women whose lives had been defined by this moment. Outside, journalists waited, unaware of how much was truly at stake. The rocket Atlas V, carrying the Prometheus craft, stood tall against the horizon, its engines ready to unleash a storm of fire and noise on the ground. The engineers who had worked sleepless nights watched with trembling hands. They knew that one tiny failure, one overlooked fraction of a second, could spell the end for everything. NASA stood for it. T-0, the engines ignited. The ground shook, the rocket rose through the clouds, trailing flame and thunder, and for a moment it seemed NASA had done it again. The mission was underway, but fate has a way of testing even the strongest resolve as Prometheus entered orbit. Telemetry showed strange fluctuations in power output. A warning light blinked on a console. A few engineers noticed it, but were told it was within acceptable range. Moments later, another spike appeared. And then another. The propulsion system began to behave unpredictably deep within the craft's reactor. An unanticipated feedback loop began forming. It was small, subtle but deadly. If it continued, it could trigger a partial core meltdown. The team faced an impossible choice: shut down the reactor and abandon the mission, or risk stabilizing it remotely. They argued. Data poured in. Simulations ran. Chaos filled the room. Finally, the flight director made the call: attempt stabilization. For the next 20 minutes, NASA lived on the edge of history. Commands were sent, signals lagged through space. The room fell silent as the team watched numbers scroll across their screens. Then suddenly the readings flatlined for 3 long seconds. No. One breathed, and then the monitors flared back to life. The reactor had stabilized. Cheers erupted. Tears filled eyes, and in that instant, Prometheus lived. NASA had survived. The mission continued successfully, completing its objectives, proving the viability of nuclear propulsion and securing the agency's future. But behind the celebration, the leadership knew how close they had come to disaster. One wrong line of code, one delayed response, and the fallout would have been global. Prometheus became a symbol not of triumph but of humility, a reminder that greatness and catastrophe are separated by only the thinnest thread. That mission the one few knew existed was the mission that nearly ended NASA, yet also the one that saved it. And from that fragile victory, NASA was reborn, looking beyond the mistakes, the pride, and the politics toward something larger. A future among the stars, built not on arrogance but on resilience. The same fire Prometheus gave mankind still burns. But now, tempered by wisdom, it's the fire that drives humanity to keep searching, to keep climbing, to keep reaching for the infinite even when the heavens seem ready to fall. As the Apollo 13 spacecraft drifted further into the cold void of space, silence filled mission control. Every monitor showed falling oxygen pressure. The once steady heartbeat of the spacecraft was fading, and with it, America's greatest dream teetered on collapse. "Houston, we've had a problem," echoed through the speakers. 5 words that changed the future of NASA forever. What started as a routine mission to the moon had just transformed into a desperate fight for survival. one that would test not just technology, but the courage, ingenuity, and unity of an entire nation. Behind those calm astronaut voices were hearts racing against time. The explosion in the oxygen tank crippled Apollo 13's service module, their main power source, their life support, their hope. Inside the spacecraft, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes could feel the temperature dropping as lights flickered out. The once bright cabin turned into an icy tomb hurtling through space. Back on Earth in Houston's Mission Control, engineers scrambled. Every screen flashed red. Alarms screamed warnings. Flight Director Gene Kranz stood like a general on the battlefield. Calm, composed, yet fully aware that the smallest error could mean death for 3 astronauts and disaster for NASA's reputation. Only a year earlier, man had walked on the moon. The world had cheered. But now that same organization stood on the brink of humiliation, and worse, loss of life in front of the entire planet. Failure is not an option, Kranz declared, and those words became the heartbeat of NASA's desperate rescue operation. Every team, from the engineers calculating oxygen levels to the mathematicians plotting return trajectories, began working non-stop, sleeping on floors, living on coffee, and feeding on adrenaline. They had one goal: bring Apollo 13 home. Inside the spacecraft, condensation covered every surface. The astronauts could see their own breath. They had to power down almost everything. No heat, no guidance computer, no running water. They were drifting blind and cold. Yet they didn't panic. Every move, every switch flip, every breath was calculated. These were men trained for the impossible, and they were living it. When NASA realized the main ship couldn't sustain life, they came up with a desperate plan: use the lunar module as a lifeboat. The lunar module wasn't designed to support 3 men for days, only 2 for a short moon landing. But this was all they had. They rerouted oxygen lines, improvised CO2 filters, and prayed their calculations were right. The crew followed instructions, turning their moon lander into a survival capsule. Back on Earth, tension filled every corner of NASA's building. Engineers tested homemade fixes on Earth, using cardboard, tape, and plastic bags to replicate what the astronauts had on board. It was ingenuity under pressure. It wasn't about pride now. It was about life. Every TV network broadcasted updates. Families watched. Children asked if the astronauts would make it home. The whole world held its breath. For NASA, this was more than a mission failure. It was a test of their existence. Congress, already questioning the billions spent on space, now had the perfect reason to shut it all down. The future of manned exploration, Mars, deep space, everything, hung by a thread. Hours turned into days. Each passing minute pushed Apollo 13 further from Earth. Calculations had to be perfect. One wrong angle during re-entry, and the capsule would skip off the atmosphere like a stone across water, lost forever. Meanwhile, the CO2 levels were rising dangerously inside the module. The astronauts could feel dizziness, nausea. The filters designed for the main ship didn't fit the lunar module. So NASA engineers on Earth built a makeshift filter from items on board: duct tape, plastic bags, and a manual cover, and radioed instructions to the crew. It was like solving a life-or-death puzzle with seconds to spare. It worked. The air cleared. The astronauts could breathe again. Hope returned, if only for a moment. Then came the re-entry plan. The spacecraft had to hit Earth's atmosphere at just the right angle. Not too shallow, not too steep. Too shallow, they'd bounce off into space. Too steep, they'd burn up. There was no room for error. Computers were off to save power, so the astronauts had to manually calculate the trajectory using nothing but a wristwatch and Earth's horizon as reference. Imagine that, guiding a broken spacecraft 200,000 miles home using pure skill and instinct. As the capsule began re-entry, Mission Control fell silent again. No one spoke. No one breathed. The radio blackout would last 4 minutes. It felt like hours. Would they make it? Had the heat shield survived the explosion? Was this the end of Apollo 13, or of NASA itself? Then a crackle. Odyssey, Houston, do you read? A pause, static. Then, Houston, this is Odyssey. We're home. Cheers erupted. Grown men cried. Engineers hugged each other. America exhaled. Against all odds, they made it. Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The world witnessed not a failure, but a miracle of human perseverance. NASA had been to the brink and back, and though Apollo 13 never landed on the moon, it achieved something far greater. It reminded humanity that courage, intelligence, and unity could turn near tragedy into triumph. But the story doesn't end there. Inside NASA, the incident sparked deep change. The agency re-examined every system, every wire, every protocol. They found that a simple wiring fault, caused by overlooked design details and pressure to meet deadlines, had nearly destroyed them. Lessons were learned the hard way. NASA's engineers vowed never again to let haste endanger lives. From then on, safety became sacred. Every mission after Apollo 13 bore its scar and its wisdom. Decades later, the legacy of Apollo 13 still echoes in every spacecraft, every control room, every new mission to the stars. When the Space Shuttle program began, and later, when Mars rovers were launched, the ghost of Apollo 13 whispered reminders: check everything, test everything, trust your people. It wasn't just a mission that nearly ended NASA, it was the mission that defined it. The near catastrophe proved that even in chaos, brilliance could rise. That even in failure, humanity could find meaning. It united scientists, engineers, and dreamers under one truth. Space exploration wasn't just about reaching the stars, it was about discovering the best in ourselves. And as NASA moves toward Mars, toward the next generation of exploration, one thing is certain: the memory of Apollo 13 will forever fuel its journey, not as a story of defeat, but as a legend of resilience written in the dark silence of space, where men refused to give up. The applause in Mission Control had barely faded when the political storm began. Apollo 13 had returned home, but NASA's wounds ran deep. Behind the cameras and public celebration, a new fear began to grow. What if this had been the end? What if the next mission didn't make it back? Congress wanted answers. The media wanted blame. And the people, once so enchanted by the dream of space, now wondered if it was worth the risk, the cost, the human lives. The Apollo program, once the pride of the nation, suddenly looked fragile, human, fallible. NASA was under fire. Every senator demanded hearings. Every engineer was questioned. The entire organization, thousands of minds, millions of parts, years of effort, now stood accused of negligence. For many inside NASA, it was not just a public inquiry. It was a personal reckoning. They had nearly lost 3 men in space. That weight would never fully leave them. But before they could face the politics, they had to face the truth. Inside a dimly lit room at Johnson Space Center, engineers and investigators gathered around tables filled with wreckage diagrams and telemetry data. The question was clear: how could one oxygen tank explode and nearly end it all? It turned out that a small, overlooked error, a damaged thermostat switch that went unnoticed through multiple inspections, had caused the explosion. That tiny flaw, buried deep in the system, became the spark that could have ended NASA's journey forever. When this discovery came to light, shame spread across departments. But also a strange kind of relief. They finally had an answer. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't fate, it was human, and therefore fixable. The Apollo 13 Review Board issued hundreds of safety recommendations. Every switch, every wire, every test protocol would now be questioned, verified, and verified again. But change wasn't easy. Inside NASA, morale was low. The engineers who had once worked like warriors now doubted themselves. Some left, others stayed, determined to rebuild. Gene Kranz, the man who had kept his cool through the crisis, became a symbol of NASA's new identity: disciplined, focused, humble. He told his team, "From now on, every mission is Apollo 13. We will never take anything for granted again." That mindset reshaped NASA from the inside out. Across the country, factories that built rocket parts were forced to adopt stricter testing standards. Suppliers were no longer just vendors. They were partners in survival. Every component became sacred. Every checklist a matter of life or death. It was no longer about racing the Soviets to the moon. It was about ensuring humanity could survive out there, far from home, in the infinite silence of space. Meanwhile, the astronauts themselves became symbols of courage. Jim Lovell, who had once dreamed of walking on the moon, accepted his fate with grace. He never got his chance to step on lunar soil. But his composure during the crisis became legendary. His voice during the worst moments, calm, measured, focused, became the standard for every astronaut who followed. Fred Haise suffered physical consequences. His body was weakened, his health tested, but his resolve was unshaken. Jack Swigert, the man who had replaced Ken Mattingly at the last moment, became a hero overnight, though privately. He carried guilt for being the one on board when everything went wrong, and Mattingly, grounded due to exposure to measles, had played a crucial role from Earth, helping the crew from the simulator, guiding them home. It was teamwork beyond boundaries, beyond ego. That perhaps was Apollo 13's greatest lesson. Humanity's strength lies not in perfection, but in cooperation. As the investigations concluded, NASA braced itself for a future filled with uncertainty. Funding was being cut. Public interest was fading. Apollo 14, the next mission, was at risk of cancellation. Many in Washington argued that the moon had already been conquered. Why risk more lives? Why spend billions on a dream? But deep inside NASA, there were those who refused to give up. If we stop now, one engineer said, then Apollo 13 wasn't a lesson. It was a tombstone. Those words reignited something. Slowly, painfully, NASA began to rebuild. Apollo 14 launched in 1971, with tighter safety systems, better communication, and hearts still haunted by the ghosts of Apollo 13. The mission was flawless. When Alan Shepard swung his golf club on the moon's surface, the world saw it not just as a symbol of triumph, but of recovery. NASA had survived, but the cost was enormous. The agency had lost its aura of invincibility. The mystique was gone. Space was no longer the realm of gods and heroes. It was a place where human mistakes could kill. Yet, maybe that was the point. Maybe NASA needed to break to truly grow. In the decades that followed, every major mission, from Skylab to the Space Shuttle to the International Space Station, carried traces of Apollo 13's DNA. Backup systems, redundancy, simulation drills for worst-case scenarios. Every astronaut was trained not just for success, but for disaster. The spirit of Apollo 13 became NASA's silent mentor. Still, the scars ran deep. The 1986 Challenger disaster reopened those wounds. So did Columbia in 2003. Each time, NASA faced the same haunting question: had they forgotten the lessons of Apollo 13? Each tragedy forced them to look inward again. Each time, they found that the hardest part of exploration wasn't distance or danger. It was complacency. Yet through it all, one truth remained: NASA never stopped. For every failure, there was resilience. For every loss, there was rebirth. And somewhere in that pattern of triumph and tragedy, the soul of human exploration took shape. The Apollo 13 mission, though decades old, remains etched in the core of every engineer and astronaut. It's not just a story of survival. It's a reminder that the cost of progress is eternal vigilance. Today, as humanity sets its sights on Mars and beyond, the ghost of Apollo 13 still whispers in the control rooms of Houston and Cape Canaveral. It reminds them that every mission is fragile, that space will always test the limits of human endurance, and that one small error can decide the fate of worlds. But it also reminds them of something greater, that courage, cooperation, and the will to solve problems under pressure can overcome even the impossible. When you look at modern missions, Artemis, the Mars rovers, the James Webb Space Telescope, you can trace their lineage back to that one frozen spacecraft drifting in the void. Because Apollo 13 didn't just shape NASA, it shaped the philosophy of exploration itself. The belief that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how impossible it seems, there is always a way home. And that, more than walking on the moon, more than planting flags, is the legacy that defines NASA to this day. After Apollo 13, NASA's engineers carried a silent vow within them: never again. That promise shaped everything that came next. When the Apollo program ended and the Saturn rockets roared for the last time, NASA entered a strange silence. The moon had been conquered, but the dream had dimmed. America was tired, budgets were shrinking, and people were asking, what's next? NASA's answer came in the form of something radical: a reusable spacecraft, a machine that could fly to orbit, return to Earth, and fly again: the Space Shuttle. It was meant to make space routine accessible, almost ordinary. But nothing about space is ever ordinary. From its earliest designs, the shuttle was haunted by Apollo 13's lessons: redundancy, fail-safes, teamwork under pressure. Every flight system had backups. Every emergency had a manual. Every crew member was trained to stay calm when things went wrong. The shuttle represented both courage and caution. It was NASA saying, we can still reach the stars, but we'll do it smarter this time. In 1981, Columbia launched the first shuttle flight. For the first time in history, a spaceship took off like a rocket and came home like a plane. The world watched in awe. NASA was back. Engineers in Houston, many of them veterans of Apollo 13, wept as Columbia touched down safely. It felt like redemption. But the truth was, beneath the confidence, fear never left. Every mission was a quiet negotiation between bravery and risk. Space travel had become routine to the public, but to those inside NASA, it was still a razor's edge. And then, in 1986, that edge cut deep. Challenger exploded just 73 seconds after liftoff. The world froze. The dream shattered again. The image of the explosion burned itself into the minds of millions. Once more, NASA faced the question it had hoped to bury after Apollo 13. What went wrong? The investigation revealed a chillingly familiar pattern. Not a single catastrophic mistake, but a series of small human ones, warnings ignored, decisions rushed, pressures mounting. Engineers had voiced concerns about the O-rings in cold weather, but managers overruled them. Safety was compromised for schedule. The same arrogance that Apollo 13 had once erased had quietly crept back in. When the Rogers Commission released its report, it might as well have been reading from Apollo 13's post-mortem. Organizational pressure, communication failure, technical oversight. History was repeating itself. Inside NASA, it was devastating. Veterans who had survived the Apollo years felt the sting deeper than anyone. They had lived through one near disaster already, and now the same mistakes had claimed lives. The silence in mission control after Challenger wasn't just grief. It was shame. But as they had done before, NASA rebuilt. Slowly, painfully. They grounded all flights for nearly 3 years, redesigned the shuttle, restructured their management, and redefined what safety meant. They learned to listen, truly listen, to their engineers again. And when the shuttle flew once more, it carried not just astronauts, but ghosts. Every mission was haunted by Challenger's smoke trail and Apollo 13's silent drift through space. Yet NASA endured because it had to. Humanity couldn't stop reaching. The 1990s brought triumphs that reignited the wonder. The Hubble Space Telescope, born of the shuttle program, giving us visions of the universe so breathtaking they made our old fears seem small. But even Hubble came with its own lesson in humility. When its mirror turned out flawed, NASA was once again forced into problem-solving mode. The repair mission, carried out by astronauts in orbit, became one of NASA's proudest moments. It proved that human hands still had a place in the cosmos. That same mix of failure and resilience carried into the 2000s, and then tragedy struck again. Columbia, the same shuttle that had once symbolized rebirth, disintegrated upon re-entry in 2003. The parallels to Apollo 13 were haunting. A small piece of foam insulation, dislodged during launch, had damaged the thermal tiles. It seemed so minor, just like that faulty switch decades before, yet it doomed the mission. The debris rained down over Texas and Louisiana. The crew never made it home. And once again, NASA faced the same soul-crushing cycle. Investigation, accountability, grief. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found that just like in 1970, NASA's greatest enemy was not space, it was itself. The organization had grown complacent again, confident in its technology, blind to its fragility. The report stated, "The causes of the accident are rooted in the same flaws that led to Challenger." That line cut through NASA's culture like a knife. It was Apollo 13's ghost screaming across time, "Remember what we learned." But here's the thing, NASA never truly forgets. Each failure, each death, becomes part of its DNA. The people inside NASA, the engineers, the flight directors, the astronauts, carry those memories like scars and shields. The organization evolves because it has no other choice. And so, out of Columbia's ashes came something extraordinary, a shift toward the future. The shuttle era eventually ended, but from it rose a new vision. Commercial partnerships, robotic missions, Mars exploration, and deep space programs like Artemis. NASA realized it could no longer do it all alone. Just as Apollo 13 had been a triumph of teamwork under pressure, the new era would be one of global collaboration. Private companies like SpaceX, Boeing, and Blue Origin stepped in. Suddenly, the idea of returning to the moon and even reaching Mars didn't seem like fantasy. It felt achievable. And through it all, the lessons of Apollo 13 still echo. Every SpaceX launch, every Artemis mission plan, carries a piece of that same discipline. Double-check everything, plan for failure, never underestimate the unknown. Even Elon Musk himself has cited Apollo 13 as an example of human ingenuity under pressure. That mission taught the world that space is not forgiving, but it rewards persistence. The irony is poetic. The mission that almost killed NASA became the one that saved it, again and again, through every generation. Today, as NASA prepares to send humans back to the moon and eventually to Mars, the spirit of Apollo 13 lives in every checklist, every emergency drill, every quiet moment when engineers sit in front of glowing monitors, watching a small craft move through the void. They know that one day, something will go wrong again. It's inevitable, but they also know they will fix it. They will find a way home. Because that's what NASA is. Not a collection of machines, but a culture, one forged in crisis, refined in failure, and defined by courage. The mission that nearly ended NASA did not end it. It remade it, and somewhere, in the darkness between Earth and the moon, a silent spacecraft still drifts in memory, a reminder that even when everything breaks, the human spirit does not. And so, as decades passed and humanity continued to send its fragile creations into the endless vacuum, the story of the mission that nearly ended NASA became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a mirror reflecting what humanity itself is capable of when faced with the impossible. A story that transcended time, politics, and technology. One that every new generation of scientists, engineers, and dreamers would inherit like an unspoken promise written in starlight. In universities, young aerospace students studied the failures and triumphs of Apollo 13 not as history, but as sacred guidance, learning how precision, humility, and collaboration could turn catastrophe into salvation. In museums, the burned and battered command module Odyssey sat under glass, not as a relic of tragedy, but as proof that survival was possible when logic, teamwork, and faith aligned. Even those who weren't alive when it happened could feel its pulse when they looked at the blackened edges of its hull, imagining what it must have been like for Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes floating in silence, seeing their breath crystallize in the freezing cabin, unsure if they would ever feel sunlight again. The lesson went beyond engineering. It became a lesson about the human condition itself, that fragility and strength are often one and the same, that endurance isn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. NASA's engineers carried that philosophy forward like torchbearers moving through darkness. When the new millennium arrived, humanity's gaze turned outward once again. Robotic explorers became our eyes and hands across the cosmos, Spirit and Opportunity roving across Mars, Cassini dancing around Saturn, New Horizons speeding beyond Pluto into interstellar night. Each of these missions owed its existence to the culture of resilience that Apollo 13 carved into NASA's DNA. And with each success, there was always an echo of that night in 1970 when Earth's brightest minds proved that intellect and unity could rewrite fate itself. But behind the wonder and discovery, there was always a shadow, a whisper reminding them how close they had come to losing it all. That whisper grew louder in the late 2010s when politics and budget cuts once again threatened NASA's future. Skeptics questioned why humanity should spend billions to chase rocks on Mars when there were problems on Earth. Inside the agency, veterans of past eras watched nervously as funding bills were debated and missions delayed. For a moment, it seemed like the dream might fade again, not through disaster this time, but through indifference. Yet once again, NASA refused to vanish. They had faced fire and silence before. They would face apathy the same way, with innovation. Instead of waiting for government approval, they reached out to private partners, transforming the very way humanity approaches space. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others entered the stage not as competitors, but as torchbearers of the same dream. The collaboration between NASA and private space companies birthed a new golden age. The lessons from Apollo 13, the necessity of communication, testing, and fail-safe thinking, were shared, taught, and applied in every new rocket design. Space travel became not just about exploration, but about survival, about ensuring that humanity would never again risk everything on ignorance. As humanity began to dream of Mars colonies and asteroid mining, one truth anchored every ambition: there can be no progress without humility before the universe. NASA had learned that the hard way. The mission that nearly ended NASA had carved that truth into its soul forever. Yet this wasn't just about machines or missions. It was about people. The astronauts of the modern era were raised on the stories of those who came before them. Many had grown up watching the film Apollo 13, their fascination with those tense hours between life and death driving them to study physics, engineering, or piloting. When they finally stood inside NASA's Johnson Space Center, they didn't just see simulators and spacecraft, they saw ghosts, felt the weight of history pressing gently against their shoulders. Every launch became a prayer, every countdown a reminder of what was at stake. Families gathered on launch days, holding their breath, knowing that the line between success and catastrophe was thinner than a strand of hair. But that fear, that awareness of mortality, gave the missions meaning. Without risk, there could be no triumph. And still, after all the decades, the phrase "failure is not an option" echoed through the halls, not as bravado, but as reverence for what those words meant when spoken in desperation by men who refused to give up. The world had changed, technology had advanced, but the essence of NASA's mission had not: to push beyond what we know, not for glory or conquest, but for understanding. That is what saved NASA, not money, not politics, but meaning. The idea that exploring the cosmos wasn't just a choice, it was an extension of what it means to be human. The very same idea that burned in the hearts of the Apollo 13 crew as they stared out at the cold light of Earth, realizing that even a fraction of failure meant extinction. And so, from that crucible of near death was born a culture of unstoppable perseverance. As new programs like Artemis took shape, aiming to return humans to the moon and establish a gateway to Mars, NASA's engineers embedded redundancy systems that trace their lineage directly to the fixes that saved Apollo 13. Multiple life support backups, cross-checked circuits, self-healing communication grids, and AI-powered failure prediction systems. Every modern spacecraft carried within it the ghost of that mission, whispering, "Plan for what you cannot see." And when Artemis I launched, blazing through the atmosphere toward lunar orbit, thousands watched the live stream with silent awe, knowing that it wasn't just a rocket ascending, it was a promise kept across generations. NASA had faced fire, loss, and bureaucracy, yet still it rose. And as the moonlight touched the metallic skin of Orion, reflecting the same silvery glow that once bathed the crippled Odyssey, it felt as though the universe itself acknowledged the endurance of humanity's will. The mission that nearly ended NASA had instead become the eternal reminder that every fall is preparation for a greater flight. Because NASA's story is not about perfection, it's about perseverance. Its survival proves that when we look beyond ourselves, we find meaning even in disaster. The cosmos may be vast and indifferent, but every spark of intelligence that looks up at the stars becomes part of something larger, something immortal. And that is why NASA will never truly die. Even if its buildings crumble and its budgets fade, its legacy will live on in every person who looks at the night sky and feels the quiet tug of curiosity. That same ancient pull that once drew sailors across oceans and now draws explorers across galaxies. The mission that nearly ended NASA was not the end. It was the beginning of everything that came after. It was the reminder that failure, when met with courage, becomes evolution. And perhaps that is what the stars have been trying to teach us all along. Because even after all the triumphs and tragedies, what truly defines NASA isn't technology, rockets, or even its missions. It's that relentless heartbeat of curiosity that refuses to die, that unyielding desire to reach beyond the known, even when everything seems lost. When you walk through NASA's corridors late at night, past old mission plaques and faded photos of astronauts, you feel it, the weight of generations who refused to surrender to despair. The janitor sweeping the floor in Building 30 knows it as much as the engineer designing life support systems for Mars. It's in the hum of the air vents, the flicker of monitors, the quiet conversations about data, probability, and hope. They all know that every time humanity sends something into the void, it's not just exploration, it's defiance. Defiance against fear, against entropy, against the limits of what we think we can endure. The mission that nearly ended NASA could have been its death sentence, but instead it became its heartbeat, its ritual reminder that survival is a choice, not an accident. There's something almost sacred about that realization, that when you face the void and decide to keep going, you give life meaning beyond survival. NASA's greatest creation was never the Saturn V or the Space Shuttle or the James Webb Telescope. It was this culture of endurance, this ability to find purpose even when surrounded by failure. And that's what separates humanity from everything else we've ever known in the universe. Machines can calculate, AI can adapt, but only humans can hope. Only humans can look at disaster and see a lesson. Only humans can nearly lose everything and come back stronger. And so the echoes of Apollo 13 still live in every new mission. When engineers gather around mission control for a new launch, they still watch the telemetry lines with the same quiet reverence that their predecessors did in 1970. They still feel that same nervous energy when the engines ignite, that same split second of silence before the rocket clears the tower and the room erupts in cheers. For a moment, everyone forgets the failures, the politics, the endless nights of testing. They remember why they do this, to touch the infinite, even for just a breath. NASA's story mirrors the story of humanity itself, flawed, fragile, endlessly ambitious. There were moments when the organization stood at the edge of collapse, when one more mistake, one more accident, might have erased decades of progress. But somehow, through courage, faith, and reason, it always found a way to endure. And maybe that's what the universe has been waiting for all along, to see if intelligence can evolve not through dominance, but through persistence. When future historians look back, they won't just see machines and missions. They'll see humanity learning to coexist with uncertainty, to turn tragedy into wisdom, to build meaning out of chaos. Because that's what NASA did when Apollo 13 failed, when Challenger burned, when Columbia fell. It refused to let those moments define the end. Instead, they became fuel, each failure a lesson that propelled the next generation forward. The mission that nearly ended NASA became the reason NASA still exists. And now, as humanity stands on the edge of a new frontier, preparing to step onto Mars, to mine asteroids, to build habitats among the stars, we do so with ghosts at our side. The men and women who once stared into the dark and dared to believe there was still light waiting beyond it. Their courage is written in every checklist, every safety protocol, every new design that aims to protect the fragile human body from the infinite. They may be gone, but their voices linger in every headset, every launch room, whispering the same words that saved Apollo 13. Let's find a way home. And perhaps that's what all of this really is, a search for home. Because maybe home isn't a planet or a place, but the feeling of connection, of unity, of striving together towards something greater. NASA's survival is proof that even when everything falls apart, if we stand together, we can rebuild, reinvent, rediscover. And maybe one day, when humans step onto another world and look up at the small blue dot in the distance, they'll remember that it all began with failure, with a mission that almost destroyed everything, but instead taught us what it means to be human. Because the universe is vast, cold, and silent, but we are not. We carry warmth wherever we go. We build meaning where there was none. And as long as that continues, as long as there are those willing to risk everything for discovery, NASA will never end. It will evolve, expand, and live on in every heart that looks at the stars and feels something awaken inside. The mission that nearly ended NASA didn't just save a crew, it saved humanity's belief in itself. And maybe that was the real mission all along. The tension in NASA's control room grew thicker as the minutes dragged on. Every console was alive with blinking lights, every face tight with focus. Engineers whispered into headsets, exchanging rapid-fire updates. Telemetry was dropping out again. One screen showed the spacecraft's last known position. Another showed the clock counting the seconds since its last transmission. 40, 50, 60. A full minute of silence. A spacecraft hundreds of millions of miles away, carrying billions of dollars worth of technology and the hopes of an entire agency, had gone dark. No signal, no heartbeat, just static. This wasn't just another technical issue. This was the moment that could have ended NASA's most ambitious mission and possibly the agency's future as we knew it. The year was 1999, and the mission in question was the Mars Climate Orbiter, a sleek, state-of-the-art spacecraft designed to study the Martian atmosphere. It was supposed to pave the way for future human missions to Mars, a cornerstone in NASA's roadmap. Everything had gone smoothly through the launch, cruise, and approach phases. But as it neared Mars, something went terribly wrong. Instead of entering orbit, the spacecraft dove too low into the planet's thin atmosphere and was destroyed. It turned out the cause wasn't a hardware malfunction or cosmic accident. It was a simple, devastating unit conversion error. One engineering team used imperial units while another used metric. The mismatch caused the orbiter to miscalculate its trajectory by nearly 100 kilometers. The smallest oversight, the kind you might make in a classroom or lab, led to the loss of a $327 million spacecraft. Inside NASA, it was chaos. The headlines were brutal. NASA loses Mars probe due to math error. Politicians demanded accountability, critics mocked the agency, and internally, morale hit rock bottom. But the real story was far more complex. This wasn't just about a conversion mistake. It was about communication breakdowns, overconfidence, and the crushing pressure to deliver success after success. Engineers had raised red flags weeks before the failure, but those warnings were brushed aside in the rush to stay on schedule. Some said NASA had become too bureaucratic. Others claimed it was stretched too thin. The truth was that NASA had been living under the shadow of its own past, haunted by the glory of the Apollo missions and the pressure to replicate that same magic in a new era with far fewer resources. After the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster, a second blow came just months later with the Mars Polar Lander. It too vanished during descent. 2 flagship missions lost in quick succession. For many inside NASA, this was the breaking point. Funding was threatened, public trust was shaken, and the once golden dream of exploring Mars began to feel cursed. Meetings grew tense. People started to leave. The agency that had once landed men on the moon was suddenly struggling to land a robot safely on another planet. But this wasn't the first time NASA had stood on the edge of disaster, and it wouldn't be the last. The seeds of resilience had been planted decades earlier. To understand how NASA survived this crisis, we need to rewind to the early days of space exploration, when failure wasn't just possible, it was expected. Back in the 1960s, during the Mercury and Gemini programs, rockets exploded on the pad almost as often as they succeeded. Each failure was brutal, public, and expensive. But each one taught NASA something vital about the unforgiving physics of spaceflight. That mindset, the willingness to learn from catastrophe, became NASA's most powerful survival instinct. And in the aftermath of the Mars failures, it resurfaced. After the twin disasters of 1999, NASA launched one of the most aggressive internal reviews in its history. The Mars Program Independent Assessment Team dissected every process, every report, every chain of communication. The findings were damning: siloed teams, inadequate testing, and a culture that prized schedule over scrutiny. Out of that chaos came reform. NASA reorganized its Mars program from the ground up, instituting clearer lines of responsibility and a renewed commitment to engineering rigor. The mantra became simple: faster, better, cheaper, but only if it works. They refused to let the Mars dream die. Within just a few years, new missions, Spirit and Opportunity, were on the drawing board. These twin rovers would be built with lessons from every past failure etched into their design. Redundant systems, extensive simulations, cross-checked metrics, nothing was left to chance. When Spirit touched down safely on Mars in January 2004, the cheers in mission control were deafening. Just 3 weeks later, Opportunity followed, bouncing to a halt on the other side of the planet. The missions were supposed to last 90 days. Instead, they lasted years. Opportunity would go on to send data for nearly 15 years, a record-breaking testament to perseverance, both human and mechanical. Those rovers didn't just explore Mars, they redeemed NASA. They proved that even after catastrophic failure, meticulous engineering and unbreakable determination could bring triumph from the ashes. But the scars of the 1999 disasters never fully faded. Inside NASA, the phrase unit conversion error became a grim shorthand for complacency. Teams were trained to double-check every number, verify every assumption, and never take communication for granted. The Mars Climate Orbiter had been lost to a single missing conversion, but its legacy would save countless future missions. The agency's transformation didn't stop there. The failures forced NASA to rethink not just its engineering, but its philosophy. Space exploration wasn't just about reaching new worlds. It was about mastering complexity, about humility before the unknown. Every success would be built on the bones of failures past, and that lesson would soon be tested again, this time in the depths of space, far beyond Mars. As the new millennium unfolded, NASA turned its gaze toward the stars once more. The Spirit and Opportunity rovers reignited public fascination with Mars, But another mission was quietly taking shape, one that would test NASA's limits like never before: the James Webb Space Telescope. Planned as the successor to Hubble, Webb was envisioned as a marvel of engineering, a giant, gold-mirrored eye capable of peering into the birth of the universe. But behind the scenes, it became one of the most challenging, delayed, and expensive projects in NASA's history. Costs ballooned from $500 million to nearly $10 billion. Components failed during testing. Timelines stretched into decades. There were moments when even high-ranking officials suggested canceling the project entirely. Yet, NASA pushed on. Engineers who had lived through the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster remembered what failure had taught them: that great leaps require risk, and risk requires preparation. The same culture of resilience that had rebuilt the Mars program now carried Webb through its darkest years. When it finally launched on Christmas Day 2021, the world held its breath. Every stage had to unfold perfectly: the separation from the rocket, the unfurling of its massive sun shield, the deployment of its mirrors. One mistake could doom the entire mission. But this time, everything worked flawlessly. When the first images came back, a nebula painted in colors never before seen, galaxies stretching back to the dawn of time, it wasn't just a triumph of technology. It was a reminder that NASA's greatest strength wasn't perfection, it was persistence. The agency that had once lost a spacecraft to a simple math error had now built the most precise telescope ever created by humankind. And yet, even now, the spirit of that long-ago near-disaster lives on in every mission briefing, every checklist, every calibration. Because for NASA, the mission that nearly ended it all was never just a story of failure. It was the rebirth of discipline, humility, and the relentless drive to explore. Every loss, every explosion, every miscalculation had carved into NASA's DNA the truth that space doesn't forgive, but it rewards those who learn. The story of the Mars Climate Orbiter wasn't the end of NASA. It was the spark that reignited its soul. But the true test of NASA's resilience would come not from Mars or the edges of the universe, but from deep within, when the agency itself began to fracture under the weight of bureaucracy, politics, and public scrutiny. After the success of Spirit and Opportunity, NASA entered what many called its Renaissance era. The rovers became household names, schools tracked their progress daily, and NASA's image as a symbol of ingenuity and courage was reborn. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming again. Funding cuts, shifting political priorities, and the retirement of the Space Shuttle program left NASA searching for identity. Without a clear path forward, the agency faced its greatest internal struggle: survival in a world that had grown impatient with slow progress. Private companies like SpaceX were rising fast, promising cheaper, faster, more daring missions. For the first time in history, NASA wasn't the only name in the sky. The pressure to remain relevant was suffocating. Inside conference rooms at Johnson and Kennedy Space Centers, debates turned into battles. Should NASA focus on Mars, on the Moon, on deep space telescopes? Every division fought for its piece of the budget, while the spirit of unity that once fueled Apollo's success began to splinter. Engineers who had once dreamed of starships now spent years writing grant proposals and fighting paperwork. "We're spending more time justifying exploration than doing it," one scientist lamented in a leaked memo. But NASA's people, scientists, engineers, visionaries, refused to give in. They'd already survived the dark days of 1999. They knew how to rebuild from ruin. Slowly, NASA began reinventing itself again, this time through collaboration. Instead of seeing SpaceX and other private companies as rivals, NASA made them partners. The agency opened its doors to commercial innovation, letting private industry handle launches and cargo deliveries, while NASA focused on what it did best, pushing the boundaries of the unknown. The new partnership wasn't smooth. In 2015, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket carrying NASA cargo exploded just minutes after launch. Critics jumped on it, calling it proof that NASA's trust in private partners was misplaced. But once again, NASA didn't retreat. Instead, they treated it as another lesson in the brutal art of exploration. They worked with SpaceX to analyze the failure, correct the systems, and return stronger. It was the same philosophy born from the Mars Climate Orbiter's ashes. Failure wasn't an end, it was data. Each crash, each malfunction, each miscalculation was another line in the manual of progress. By 2020, the partnership had paid off. SpaceX successfully launched astronauts to the International Space Station from American soil for the first time since the Space Shuttle's retirement. NASA was no longer a relic. It was the architect of a new space era. The agency had evolved from a lone pioneer into the beating heart of a global effort to reach beyond Earth. But even as it looked outward, NASA's greatest mission was once again unfolding far away, on the surface of Mars. The Perseverance rover, launched in 2020, was more than just another machine. It was the culmination of every lesson, every scar, every hard-won victory. Packed with instruments capable of detecting ancient biosignatures, Perseverance wasn't just exploring. It was hunting for life. It carried Ingenuity, a small helicopter that would make the first powered flight on another world, a feat once thought impossible. The mission symbolized how far NASA had come since 1999, when a simple miscalculation destroyed a spacecraft. Now, the agency was orchestrating synchronized flights between a rover and an aircraft millions of miles away. When Ingenuity's tiny rotors spun against the thin Martian air and lifted off, humanity proved that flight wasn't confined to Earth. It was a quiet miracle, and a loud reminder that failure had forged NASA's greatness. Yet even in its triumphs, danger always lurked. Space is a cruel teacher, and one of its lessons came crashing down in 2003 with the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Just 16 minutes before landing, Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. It was the second shuttle disaster after Challenger, and it devastated NASA to its core. Once again, the agency was forced to face the brutal truth that progress in space is written in blood. Investigations revealed that the cause was a piece of foam insulation that broke off during launch, striking the shuttle's wing. A problem known for years, but one that had been normalized, accepted as low risk. The phrase, normalization of deviance, entered NASA's vocabulary, a deadly reminder that complacency kills. But just as before, NASA confronted the horror with introspection and reform. Engineers overhauled safety protocols, instituted independent review boards, and rewrote the agency's culture from within. They swore never again to let routine blind them to risk. The shuttle program would end years later, but its legacy would live on in every new spacecraft designed after it, from Orion to SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Every bolt, every circuit, every launch check was a promise kept to the lost crews of Challenger and Columbia. By the time Perseverance touched down safely in 2021, it wasn't just landing on Mars. It was landing on the shoulders of decades of sacrifice. Millions watched live as Mission Control erupted in tears and cheers. For a moment, Earth felt united again. The same agency that had nearly collapsed under its own mistakes had just made history once more. But perhaps the most poetic part of NASA's journey is this: every mission that nearly ended them became the reason they endured. The Mars Climate Orbiter's failure birthed a new culture of precision. The shuttle disasters inspired the safest spacecraft in history. The budget cuts sparked a revolution in collaboration. Each crisis reshaped NASA into something stronger, leaner, and wiser. Today, as Artemis prepares to send humans back to the Moon and onward to Mars, NASA stands at the threshold of its next great test. The technology is new, the risks are enormous, and the stakes are higher than ever. But one thing is certain: the ghosts of 1999 still whisper in every launch pad, every control room, every line of code. They remind everyone wearing a NASA badge that the smallest detail can decide between triumph and tragedy. And maybe that's the essence of space exploration, the balance between perfection and peril, between ambition and humility. NASA's story is not one of flawless success, it's one of relentless endurance. From the first Mercury rockets that exploded before clearing the tower, to the rovers that wandered across alien sands, to the telescopes gazing into the birth of stars, every failure has been a foundation. Every mistake, a milestone. The mission that nearly ended NASA was never truly about a spacecraft. It was about the people behind it. The engineers who refused to quit, the scientists who stayed late nights rechecking numbers, the visionaries who looked at catastrophe and saw a challenge. Because at the heart of NASA isn't technology or machinery, it's faith. Faith that even when everything burns, the next launch will fly. Faith that somewhere in the silence of the cosmos, there's something waiting to be discovered. And as long as there are people willing to take that risk, to push buttons knowing they might fail, to aim rockets at the stars and hope they return, NASA will never end. It will evolve, adapt, and rise again, just as it always has, and yet even now. As NASA charts its next course toward Mars and beyond, the shadow of that near ending still lingers, a constant reminder of how fragile progress can be. The agency stands like a scarred warrior, carrying every burn mark and bruise as proof of survival. Inside Mission Control, screens glow with simulations of future flights, spacecraft designs sleek and silver, habitats built for lunar soil, engines tested to roar across the void. But among the hum of machines and the chatter of data streams, there's always a quiet reverence for what almost was lost. Younger engineers, many not even born when the Mars Climate Orbiter vanished, still learn its story on their first day at NASA. It's not just history, it's a warning, a lesson carved into the DNA of space exploration. In briefings, the phrase "check your units" echoes like a mantra, not because of its simplicity, but because it symbolizes everything that can go wrong when attention falters for even a second. For these scientists, precision isn't paperwork, it's survival. Every mission is now designed with layers of redundancy, systems cross-checking each other in a delicate choreography where failure is not eliminated, but understood. And yet, for all the complexity of the technology, what drives NASA isn't just data or calculations, it's belief. Others find it in the hum of rockets being tested for Artemis, or in the silent patience of the Perseverance rover, listening for echoes of life across Martian plains. Each of them, knowingly or not, fights the same battle NASA fought in 1999, the battle between human error and human greatness. But the more we look back, the clearer it becomes that NASA's greatest victories were born in the ashes of its darkest hours. Without the Climate Orbiter's loss, there might have been no Perseverance. Without the shuttle's tragedies, there would be no Orion spacecraft capable of carrying humans deeper into space than ever before. Without the budget struggles, NASA might never have opened its arms to collaboration, ushering in a new era where private companies build rockets while NASA builds dreams. The irony is poetic. The mission that nearly ended NASA also saved it. It forced humility upon an organization built on confidence. It made them remember that exploration isn't about conquest, it's about respect. Respect for the universe, for the precision of physics, for the courage of those who dare to touch the stars. And that respect has reshaped NASA's philosophy entirely. Today, missions are designed with a mindset of stewardship, not domination. They don't just ask, "How far can we go?" but "How wisely can we go?" The agency now carries not only the weight of human ambition, but the responsibility of representing all of Earth, its mistakes, its lessons, its fragile unity. When Artemis astronauts step onto the moon again, they won't just be walking for America or science, they'll be walking for every mistake that taught humanity how to rise again. And as NASA prepares for even bolder journeys, to Mars, to icy moons like Europa and Enceladus, perhaps even beyond the solar system, the ghosts of the past will walk with them. They'll whisper reminders of Columbia, of Challenger, of lost rovers and shattered dreams, not to haunt, but to guide. Because NASA's strength was never in its technology, it was always in its memory. It remembers what went wrong so others don't have to repeat it. It remembers that failure is not defeat, it's calibration. And in that memory lies immortality. Imagine, one day, a new generation standing on Martian soil, gazing back at a pale blue dot in the sky, knowing that every inch of their journey was paved by those who refused to quit when everything broke. They'll dig into red dust, not just searching for microbes, but for meaning, for proof that humanity's story was always meant to reach this far. Perhaps they'll uncover fossils, or perhaps nothing at all. But even if Mars is silent, the echo of human perseverance will roar louder than any alien discovery, because NASA's true mission was never about finding life out there. It was about proving life here was capable of reaching out. From the first wooden satellites to billion-dollar rovers, from fiery disasters to triumphant landings, the story remains the same. Progress built on faith, resilience born from loss. And as long as a single human looks up at the night sky and wonders, what's next, NASA's work will never be done. The mission that nearly ended NASA was not a curse, it was a rebirth. It taught humanity the most sacred rule of exploration. The stars do not forgive arrogance, but they reward perseverance. The universe is vast, indifferent, and cold. But within that darkness, one small species dared to light rockets and reach for eternity. And even when they failed, they tried again. That is NASA. That is the legacy that will outlive every mission, every error, every generation. The mission that nearly ended NASA became the mission that defined it, an eternal reminder that the road to the stars is carved by those willing to fall, learn, and rise once more. And so, as the decades unfold and humanity stands at the threshold of becoming an interplanetary species, NASA's legacy stretches across time like a constellation of triumphs and scars woven together into one continuous story of human persistence. Deep in the quiet corridors of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where the walls are lined with mission patches and photographs of every spacecraft ever launched, there's an almost spiritual stillness. Every monitor hums with the pulse of data, coming from millions of miles away, numbers, graphs, blips of light traveling through deep space, and each one is a heartbeat of exploration. The people who sit behind those screens are no longer the same generation that witnessed the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster, but the lessons of that moment live in their fingertips as they type commands, cross-check data, and whisper to each other during long nights that blur into dawn. There's a ritual to it, a sacred patience that only those who chase the unknown can understand. The new engineers know that every command they send into the void carries the weight of history, that a single misstep could undo years of work. That precision is not optional, it's survival. They joke, they stress, they celebrate small successes, but deep down they are bound by an unspoken understanding. Space exploration is not for the proud, it's for the persistent. Outside the glass walls, the world they protect changes faster than ever. Technology races ahead, attention spans shrink, and people demand instant results. But NASA remains deliberately slow, careful, meticulous, because it has learned what haste costs. The mission that nearly ended NASA taught humanity that greatness is measured not in speed, but in endurance. The agency's evolution into the modern era reflects that wisdom. With Artemis, they aimed to return humans to the moon, not as a repeat of Apollo, but as a rehearsal for Mars. The difference now is collaboration, international partners, commercial innovators, and artificial intelligence working hand in hand to minimize risk and expand possibility. It's no longer a race, it's a collective ascent. In Houston, older engineers who lived through the shuttle era mentor the new recruits, telling them about the days when a misplaced conversion could destroy a spacecraft, or when a broken seal could take 7 lives. They speak with quiet reverence, not fear, because they know that remembering pain keeps the mission alive. These stories, passed down like sacred texts, are the soul of NASA, a living archive of triumph built from tragedy. And yet, even as the agency prepares for Mars, there's a sense of humility in every plan. They know the risks. They know that no simulation can fully predict what awaits them beyond Earth's cradle. They know that one day, another mission might fail, another mistake might be made, and another moment of silence might echo across the world. But this time they'll be ready, not immune, but wiser. Because failure no longer breaks NASA, it builds it. The rovers on Mars continue to whisper messages of perseverance through their transmissions. Curiosity still roams, perseverance drills. Into rock, and even long-dead spirit and opportunity have become symbols of undying will. The images they've sent home, valleys carved by ancient rivers, dust devils swirling across crimson plains, sunsets tinted blue, remind us that the universe is alive with mystery, and within that mystery, NASA's purpose breathes. The mission that nearly ended NASA wasn't about loss, it was about rediscovery. It forced the agency to strip away arrogance, to face its own fallibility, and to emerge stronger, kinder, more human. The lesson extends beyond rockets and rovers. It mirrors life itself. We fall, we correct, we continue. And so, in a sense, NASA became a reflection of humanity's greatest truth, that growth is born from imperfection. As night falls over the Kennedy Space Center, the launch pad stands silent, waiting. Somewhere, deep underground, engineers check pressure gauges and countdown systems. The next mission is ready, Maybe it's another rover. Maybe it's a telescope. Maybe it's a crew of astronauts preparing to leave Earth behind for years. Whatever it is, it carries with it the echoes of every mission that came before. The cheers, the failures, the sleepless nights, the names of those who never made it home. Above them, the sky stretches endless, scattered with stars that once terrified and inspired ancient humans. Those same stars now serve as waypoints for spacecraft that bear the fingerprints of every mistake ever made and corrected. And in that poetic symmetry lies NASA's immortality. It doesn't just reach for the stars, it learns from them. The mission that nearly ended NASA will never truly end, because its lesson is infinite. It's written in the circuitry of Perseverance, in the golden panels of Voyager, in the mirrored eyes of the James Webb Telescope. It's in every student who dreams of building a rocket, in every scientist who double-checks their equations at midnight, in every whisper of static that travels back across the cosmic sea to say, "We made it." The universe is vast, cold, and uncaring, but humanity, through NASA, has found a way to speak within it, not with arrogance, but with awe, not with certainty, but with courage. And so, as another countdown begins and another rocket prepares to pierce the sky, the ghosts of past missions watch silently, not as reminders of failure, but as guardians of wisdom. The flame ignites, the engines roar, and the earth trembles, as it always has when humanity dares to defy gravity. In that moment, everything, the triumphs, the disasters, the lessons, merges into one truth. The mission that nearly ended NASA is also the one that ensures it will never truly fall again. Because now NASA doesn't just launch rockets, it launches legacies, carrying with it the memory of every mistake turned miracle, every failure reborn as innovation, and every lost crew immortalized through progress. As the engines roar to life and the countdown echoes across the coast of Florida, you can feel the weight of history vibrating in the air. The ghosts of Challenger, Columbia, the lost Mars missions, all watching from the unseen edges of eternity. The sky bursts open in white fire as another spacecraft climbs upward, cutting through clouds like a promise. Inside Mission Control, hearts race, breaths are held, eyes locked on screens showing telemetry data, pressure levels, and trajectory lines. Every number, every decimal, every confirmation is a symphony of redemption. The flight directors whisper, "Go," and the world collectively exhales. Yet even in that moment of triumph, everyone there knows that perfection doesn't exist in spaceflight. It only exists in the relentless pursuit of it. Each success is temporary, fragile, but it carries meaning because it's born from struggle. NASA has learned that exploration is not about certainty. It's about courage in uncertainty. That's what makes their missions divine, not just the science, but the faith behind it. Faith that humans, though imperfect, can build something that touches the stars. In the decades since that nearly fatal failure, NASA has become something far more profound than a space agency. It's become a living testament to what persistence can achieve when driven by curiosity and humility. The James Webb Space Telescope now floats in the silence of space, looking back to the birth of galaxies, capturing light that has traveled for billions of years. Every photon it collects is older than our species, older than Earth's continents, older than the word mistake. And yet, all that ancient light is now being interpreted by minds that once miscalculated a unit of force. The irony is poetic. The same species that lost a spacecraft because of a small human error now decodes the origins of the universe. That is the essence of redemption. Meanwhile, on Mars, Perseverance continues its work. It drills into stones older than human civilization, searching for microscopic fossils, for any sign that life might not be unique to Earth. Each sample tube sealed in the Martian dust represents centuries of human effort, generations of people who believed in something greater than themselves. And somewhere far beyond, the Voyagers, two tiny ambassadors launched before most of today's scientists were born, sail through interstellar space, carrying with them messages of peace, music, and human voices. They've been traveling for nearly half a century now, further than any object humanity has ever made, whispering data across the void to a planet that once almost gave up on space. That's the beauty of NASA's story. It's not linear. It's cyclical. Every fall leads to flight. Every end births a new beginning. Even the phrase, "the mission that nearly ended NASA," is a paradox, because it never truly ended. It evolved, transformed, ascended. The agency's strength has never been its technology. It's the unbreakable spirit of its people. The janitor sweeping the floor at Kennedy Space Center, when asked what he does, once said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." That's the essence of NASA, an institution where every hand, every mind, every heartbeat contributes to something larger than life. And as humanity stands on the brink of becoming multiplanetary, that shared purpose has never been more vital. For NASA, the next frontier isn't just Mars, it's meaning. It's proving that human exploration can coexist with wisdom, that ambition doesn't have to be blind, and that knowledge can be pursued with both logic and reverence. The new generation of explorers doesn't chase glory, they chase understanding. They design spacecraft not just to survive the void, but to listen to it, to study, to learn, to respect. Because if there's one thing the mission that nearly ended NASA taught, it's that the universe demands humility. You can't conquer the stars. You can only earn their silence. And now, as humanity prepares for the Artemis missions, to return to the moon and stay there, to build bases, to test systems for Mars, the echoes of that humility guide every decision. The teams double-check their units, cross-verify their metrics, triple-inspect their code. Each test, each countdown, each launch carries that invisible scar from 1999, that quiet reminder of how close it all came to ending. But scars don't weaken, they fortify. They remind the soul what it has survived. So when the next rocket lifts off and the camera pans to the faces of the people who made it possible, you'll see generations reflected in their eyes. Those who failed, those who learned, those who never stopped believing. Because NASA's story is not about reaching the stars, it's about proving that humans can grow worthy of them. And perhaps that's the truest form of exploration. Not discovering new worlds, but rediscovering what it means to be human in the process. The mission that nearly ended NASA became the story that defines our species. A story written in fire, dust, and faith. A story that begins not with perfection, but with a single human error corrected by infinite determination. And so it continues, one launch, one discovery, one heartbeat at a time as humanity keeps reaching upward. Not because it's easy, not because it's certain, but because deep down, we were never meant to stay still. And yet, as Apollo 13's crippled ship limped home through the silent void, something extraordinary unfolded. What could have been NASA's darkest failure transformed into one of humanity's most defining moments of teamwork, intellect, and resilience. On board, Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes had just 15 minutes of power left in the command module. Every breath exhaled more carbon dioxide into the small lunar module that had become their lifeboat, threatening to suffocate them before they could even re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the mission control team in Houston, an orchestra of engineers, scientists, and mathematicians, worked around the clock, fueled by coffee, fear, and faith. They weren't just solving equations, they were solving survival itself. Every watt of power, every drop of water, every ounce of oxygen was calculated and recalculated by hand because computers of that era were primitive by today's standards. The famous line, "Failure is not an option," wasn't bravado. It was the pulse that kept everyone alive through that endless night. Using slide rules, pencils, and chalkboards, engineers devised new procedures in real time, guiding the astronauts through the shutdown of non-essential systems and the rerouting of power to critical life support circuits. On board, temperatures dropped near freezing. Frost formed on the inside of the windows, and the men shivered in silence, using their breath to write reminders on fogged glass. Yet even in those haunting conditions, they joked, supported one another, and followed every instruction with calm precision. It was an eerie ballet between man and machine, Earth and space, hope and despair. When the moment came for re-entry, the world held its breath. News anchors, school children, scientists, and even heads of state paused everything. Would the heat shield hold? Would they burn up in the atmosphere? Would the radio blackout end in static or a human voice? And then, after those agonizing minutes of silence, came the crackle over the radio. "Houston, this is Odyssey. It's good to see you again." The room exploded in cheers and tears. Apollo 13, the mission that nearly ended NASA, had become a story of human ingenuity that defined what space exploration truly meant. Not just reaching new worlds, but defying impossible odds. But what few knew was how close it came to changing NASA forever. In the aftermath, Congress questioned the funding of future missions. The public's confidence wavered, and many wondered whether the dream of the stars was worth the cost in lives and billions. Behind closed doors, NASA leadership was divided. Some argued to slow down, to become cautious and political. Others insisted that exploration was humanity's nature, that the stars called, and they had to answer. In those tense months, engineers pored over every wire, every valve, every line of code, realizing how a single spark had nearly erased years of progress. And yet, instead of retreating, NASA learned, adapted, evolved. They redesigned spacecraft with redundancy, trained astronauts not just for success but for disaster, and turned Apollo 13 into a living textbook on crisis management. The legacy of that near-fatal mission rippled outward, shaping everything from space shuttle protocols to deep space robotics decades later. It taught the agency and the world that failure, while terrifying, is also the greatest teacher. And perhaps, without that moment of near catastrophe, humanity might never have developed the grit to reach further, to send rovers to Mars, probes to Saturn, and telescopes beyond the edge of the solar system. But even as NASA rebuilt its image, a darker truth simmered beneath: the growing political tension of the Cold War, budget cuts, and shifting public interest threatened to ground the next generation of explorers. Yet, deep within NASA's corridors, there were whispers of something bigger, a mission that would push beyond the moon, a dream to visit Mars, a plan that would define a new era of discovery. But as history shows, every great leap begins at the edge of disaster, and for NASA, Apollo 13 was that precipice, the point where courage met chaos and humanity proved, once again, that it could rise from its own ashes to touch the infinite. But the story didn't end when Apollo 13 splashed down safely. It was only the beginning of NASA's most difficult introspection, a period when every engineer, astronaut, and leader had to face the brutal truth of how close they came to losing everything. In the days that followed, the astronauts were hailed as heroes. But the mood inside NASA was far from celebratory. Teams spent sleepless nights reconstructing timelines, dissecting data, and tracing every second leading up to the explosion. They examined every bolt, wire, and oxygen tank, searching for the smallest clue that could explain what had gone wrong. It wasn't long before they found the culprit, a damaged wire inside an oxygen tank that had been exposed to higher than normal voltages during a pre-flight test. That one hidden flaw, a single overlooked detail, had brought the world's most advanced space program to its knees. The investigation revealed a painful reality. In the race to meet deadlines and impress Congress, safety protocols had been bent, assumptions made, and warnings missed. The Apollo 13 accident was not just mechanical, it was human. But from that humility grew resilience. Engineers began to reimagine spacecraft as not just vehicles for exploration, but as ecosystems of survival. Every system was re-engineered with backups to the backups. Every astronaut was trained not just to execute, but to improvise, to think like an engineer when faced with the unknown. The phrase "work the problem" became a sacred mantra within NASA, an attitude that every challenge, no matter how catastrophic, could be solved through focus, creativity, and teamwork. As Apollo 14 prepared to launch, the world watched anxiously. Would NASA dare to fly again so soon after nearly losing 3 lives? The astronauts themselves knew the risks, but their courage was undiminished. "We learn from every mistake," said Alan Shepard, the commander, before liftoff. "And we carry that lesson to the stars." The mission succeeded, restoring confidence in NASA's capabilities, yet the specter of Apollo 13 never fully vanished. It lingered as a warning, a shadow that whispered caution every time a new spacecraft left the pad. And as the Apollo program wound down, another challenge emerged. One not of technology, but of purpose. Humanity had walked on the moon, proven its dominance in space, and yet the question arose: what next? The world was changing. Political winds shifted, budgets tightened, and enthusiasm for space began to fade among the public. Inside NASA, a quiet battle was brewing between visionaries who wanted to reach Mars and administrators who needed to justify every dollar spent. The shuttle program was born out of that compromise, a reusable spacecraft meant to make space routine, to turn exploration into infrastructure. But in the ambition to make spaceflight accessible, NASA faced a new kind of danger: the illusion of safety. Years later, as the Space Shuttle Challenger prepared for launch on a cold January morning in 1986, that illusion shattered. Engineers had warned of failing O-rings, but the pressure to maintain schedules and media appearances outweighed caution. 73 seconds after liftoff, the world watched in horror as Challenger disintegrated in the sky, taking 7 lives, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. The heartbreak echoed the fear of Apollo 13, but this time there was no happy ending. The same agency that had defied death and returned from space's edge now faced accusations of arrogance and neglect. Congress demanded answers. The public demanded accountability. Inside NASA, silence hung heavy. How could an organization built on precision and courage have ignored its own engineers' warnings? Once again, investigations tore through every layer of bureaucracy, revealing patterns all too familiar: overconfidence, communication breakdowns, and the ever-present pressure of deadlines. Yet from this devastation came another rebirth. The Challenger disaster forced NASA to confront its own humanity once more. Safety culture became sacred. Voices of dissent were no longer dismissed but amplified. Every launch henceforth carried the ghosts of both Apollo 13 and Challenger, reminders that space was not forgiving, that progress was paid for in risk and remembrance. When the shuttle returned to flight in 1988, it did so under new principles: transparency, caution, and collective accountability. And for a while it worked. NASA's triumphs returned: satellites, telescopes, deep space missions, the building of the International Space Station, all became symbols of renewed trust. But history, as it often does, repeated itself. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia met the same fate as Challenger, disintegrating upon re-entry after foam debris damaged its wing during launch. Again, the world mourned. Again, NASA was forced to reckon with its flaws. Each tragedy was a scar etched into the legacy of exploration, a reminder that every ascent into the heavens carried the weight of human imperfection. Yet through it all, NASA never stopped looking upward. The same spirit that saved Apollo 13 burned on in every engineer who refused to give up, in every astronaut who strapped themselves into a rocket knowing the risks. And in that defiance, that audacity to keep going despite catastrophe, NASA discovered its truest mission: not just to explore space, but to explore the limits of human endurance, innovation, and faith. That mission, tested, scarred, and reborn through failure, became the backbone of every venture that followed. When NASA faced the uncertain years after the Columbia disaster, it was no longer an agency intoxicated by victory, but one grounded in humility and purpose. The leadership shifted its focus from speed to sustainability, from racing rivals to ensuring survival. They began building not just rockets, but resilience, machines and minds capable of enduring the unendurable. The International Space Station became a living laboratory, a symbol of what humanity could achieve when cooperation replaced competition. For 2 decades, it circled Earth, a fragile beacon of peace where astronauts from once hostile nations worked side by side, breathing the same recycled air, solving the same mechanical puzzles, united by curiosity rather than politics. Meanwhile, robotic explorers continued where humans could not go. Voyager, still whispering across the darkness after 40 years. Cassini diving through Saturn's rings in a poetic farewell. And Hubble, peering into the heart of creation itself. Yet even as NASA pushed outward, it faced a new challenge on Earth: the erosion of public faith. People had grown distracted, consumed by screens, wars, and the noise of daily survival. The space program that once united humanity now struggled for attention. Budgets were cut, missions delayed, dreams deferred. But in the quiet corners of NASA's labs, something extraordinary was being born. The next generation of explorers were not content to live off old glories. They were building something bigger: machines that could think, navigate, and survive without constant human control. They envisioned a future where humanity was not chained to one world but spread across many. Mars was back on the horizon, no longer as a dream but as a destination. Private companies began to join the race, blending profit with passion, ambition with engineering. The partnership between NASA and private pioneers like SpaceX reignited the spark that had dimmed since the moon landings. Reusable rockets returned to Earth like boomerangs. Telescopes mapped planets in distant solar systems. Rovers on Mars took selfies and drilled into red dust, searching for echoes of ancient water. Yet through it all, the ghost of Apollo 13 lingered, a quiet reminder that technology could fail, that space was not a playground, but a battlefield between human will and cosmic indifference. Every triumph still carried risk. Every launch still invoked a prayer. The phrase "failure is not an option," born in the heat of that fateful 1970 mission, became both a mantra and a warning. It wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. Even as humanity turned its eyes toward the moon again with the Artemis missions, the legacy of the past guided every decision. The moon was no longer a flag-planting contest. It was a rehearsal for Mars, a testbed for living off Earth. NASA engineers designed habitats that could withstand radiation, robots that could build shelters, and systems that could recycle every drop of air and water. They weren't just preparing to visit another world. They were preparing to stay. And in that vision, one could feel the heartbeat of Apollo 13, of Challenger, of Columbia, a chorus of lessons learned in pain but carried forward in hope. The story of NASA is, in truth, the story of humanity itself. Our brilliance and our blindness, our courage and our fragility. Every setback forced us to evolve. Every tragedy made the next triumph possible. When Perseverance rover landed on Mars in 2021, its name felt prophetic, a tribute to the endurance that had defined the space program from its near-death moments to its rebirths. As it sent back images of alien horizons bathed in dusty light, the world was reminded once again that exploration is not about perfection, but persistence. The mission that nearly ended NASA had instead transformed it. From the wreckage of Apollo 13's oxygen tank to the gleaming wings of Orion, from the silence of the moon to the roar of Falcon rockets, NASA's journey mirrored humanity's greatest truth, that progress is born not from certainty, but from struggle. Every launch is a gamble against gravity, every orbit a defiance of fate, every landing a whisper that we are still here, still reaching. And perhaps, when future historians look back on this era, they won't just see machines and milestones. They'll see something far deeper, the unbroken thread of human spirit that refused to surrender to failure. Because in the end, the mission that nearly ended NASA did something far greater. It reminded us that space is not just the final frontier, it is the ultimate mirror, reflecting both our flaws and our infinite potential. And as NASA continued its journey into the unknown, it faced a future both exhilarating and uncertain, a horizon filled with promise and peril. The agency's vision expanded beyond the familiar orbits of Earth, beyond the safe routines of satellite launches and space station maintenance, into the wild frontier of interplanetary travel and deep space exploration. Humanity was on the verge of rewriting its own destiny, but the lessons of the past, the near disasters, the moments when everything almost fell apart, still haunted every decision. Engineers double-checked every wire, every valve, every circuit board, because they knew that one overlooked detail could unravel decades of progress. The ghost of Apollo 13 whispered through mission control: caution, precision, teamwork. The legacy of Challenger and Columbia echoed in every safety protocol: never again. But even as the scars remained, so did the hunger to go further. The Artemis program, named for Apollo's twin sister, became the next great step, a mission to return humanity to the moon, not as visitors, but as settlers. For NASA, it was both redemption and resurrection. The same agency that had nearly lost everything now aimed to establish the foundation for a civilization beyond Earth. They dreamed of lunar bases glowing under the eternal darkness of space, astronauts walking among robotic builders, mining ice for water and oxygen, and testing the technologies that would one day carry humans to Mars. The vision was breathtaking, but it demanded everything: money, innovation, and above all, faith. Because no matter how advanced our machines become, spaceflight remains an act of faith. Faith in math, in physics, in human ingenuity, and in the unseen hand that holds the universe together. The people behind the scenes, the scientists, the programmers, the janitors who cleaned the labs, each became part of something greater than themselves. It was not just about launching rockets. It was about proving that humanity could rise after every fall. As missions became more complex, NASA learned to embrace collaboration instead of competition. They worked hand in hand with international partners, blending languages, cultures, and dreams into a single purpose. European, Japanese, and Canadian astronauts trained alongside Americans. Russian modules docked with American stations. Private companies built rockets that NASA once would have made in secret. The lines between nations began to blur, replaced by a shared goal to survive beyond Earth. And through all this, a quiet question pulsed beneath the surface. What if the mission that nearly ended NASA had actually saved it? What if the failures were not curses but catalysts? Without Apollo 13, perhaps NASA would have grown complacent. Without Challenger, perhaps it would have forgotten humility. Without Columbia, maybe it would never have reimagined safety. Every failure had reshaped the agency into something wiser, stronger, more human. In a way, the cosmos itself had been teaching us. Each tragedy became a test of endurance, each triumph a reward for persistence. And still the dream grew larger. Plans were drafted for human missions to Mars, for telescopes that could see the birth of galaxies, for robotic probes that could touch the icy hearts of comets. Every idea that once seemed impossible was now on the table. The same agency that once struggled to fix a broken oxygen tank was now building machines capable of surviving the storms of Jupiter. Yet, amid all this progress, NASA faced a paradox. It was simultaneously the symbol of human advancement and a fragile institution constantly fighting for survival. Political tides shifted, budgets fluctuated, and public interest ebbed and flowed. There were times when it felt like the stars themselves were out of reach again, when space exploration was dismissed as too expensive, too risky, too distant from the struggles of daily life. But then something would happen. A rocket launch lighting up the sky, a rover's image from Mars, a child staring in wonder at a model of Saturn V, and suddenly the spark would reignite. Because deep down, humanity cannot stop looking up. It is written in our nature to wonder, to question, to dream beyond the horizon. That's why even after everything, after the explosions, the heartbreak, the almost endings, NASA endured. It wasn't just an agency. It was a reflection of the human soul, of our eternal battle between fear and faith. The mission that nearly ended NASA became the foundation for everything that followed. The silent promise that no matter how dark the night, we would always find a way to rise again, to rebuild, to return to the stars.